Good evening, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal, Canada, with my latest rant of the week. Not surprisingly, my rant this week will concern the just announced withdrawal of Joe Biden from the 2024 presidential election. Now, I have a lot to say about this tonight, and I'm going to try to gather my thoughts and summarily present to you why I feel this merits an epic rant. I'm going to try to remain calm through all of this, despite the intensity of my feelings on this subject. And I'm going to start by going back to an op-ed that I authored in November of 2020. And this was a few days after Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump in the election and 2 months before Biden took office. The article in question, the op-ed, was titled, "The King is Dead, Long Live the King." And you can find it on the website of Canadian Dimension, amongst other platforms. And in that article, I warned 2 months before Genocide Joe took office, our fellow progressives and leftists who were celebrating Biden's victory, that based upon Biden's interminable, extensive political record, there was absolutely no reason to celebrate at all. Now, I wrote a comprehensive review, or tried to offer a fairly comprehensive review of Biden's record, but I'm going to quote to you one part of that review, and it concerned the whole kit and caboodle. I looked at his attitude towards healthcare, towards financial regulation, towards the military-industrial complex, towards the whole question of democracy and so forth. I looked at racism, anti-racism, and I'm just going to focus in particular on one paragraph from the part of my op-ed where I was offering an assessment of Biden's highly extensive record, and that concerned war. And I wrote as follows: Biden is a warmonger. He supported Bush's criminal war in Iraq, and before that, the bombing of Yugoslavia. The NATO-led destruction of Libya happened while Biden served as vice president, as did Obama's drone-killing spree. In one of the debates leading up to this year's election, Biden vowed to make Iran, a country whose people have been devastated by U.S. sanctions, quote, pay a price, close quote, for the unsubstantiated claim that its government tried to interfere in the U.S. election, a claim for which there was really no proof whatsoever. During his presidential campaign, Biden assured the press that he foresaw no significant cuts to the U.S. government's stratospheric military spending. Indeed, within hours of his victory, defense contractors expressed confidence that Biden will preserve the status quo. So that was my quick and dirty assessment of Biden's extensive record on the question of war. And then I went on towards the end of the article and I wrote, in the final analysis, the best indication we have about the type of leader Joe Biden will be is the assurance he provided to some of his rich donors at a ritzy Manhattan fundraiser in June of last year. If he were to become the president of the United States, Biden told them, quote, nothing would fundamentally change, close quote. And I concluded my article by writing, mercifully, Trump has lost, but the profound injustices that empowered him sadly remain. Now, today, hours after Biden announced his withdrawal from the Democratic Party race, a geopolitical commentator whom I follow and for whom I have much respect, Arnaud Bertrand, I believe he's a French national. He comments extensively on America's hegemonic project and its friction and conflicts, in particular with China. And he wrote as follows today: Biden stands down and will undoubtedly be remembered as one of the U.S.'s worst ever presidents. Besides the obvious fact that his mind was gone, he unconditionally supported one of the worst atrocities in modern times in Gaza, helped trigger and fuel the biggest war on the European continent since World War II, with hundreds of thousands of dead, and he almost certainly gave the order to bomb Nord Stream, an act of war against Europe. On top of driving up tensions needlessly with China, trying to stop their technological development, and to impoverish 1.4 billion people, driving up the U.S. debt to insane levels, and in brackets, the president under whom interest rate payments on debt overtook the defense budget, and so on and so forth. And then Bertrand concludes his post with this sentence: all around disaster for both the US and the world, a very dark chapter, yet another one in US history. I could not agree more with every sentiment that he expressed. I'm going to elaborate now on why I agree. I'm going to start by talking about the Ukraine war. Now, in February of 2022, within a few days of the invasion of Russia having been commenced, I wrote an article in which I commented on both the legality and the inevitability of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I looked at the cold, hard terms of international law, the UN Charter and so forth, analyzed the circumstances, and came to the conclusion that this probably did violate international law. But on the other hand, I understood exactly why Russia was doing it, was not remotely surprised, and was absolutely convinced, as I explained in my article, that the West had provoked the invasion. The West knew for decades that the entire political elite of Russia regarded Ukraine's membership in NATO as a red line, as a severe existential threat to Russia. The communists believed this, the pro-Western liberals believed this, Putin's party believed this, the people to the right of Putin on the political spectrum, and yes, there are people to the right of Putin on Russia's political spectrum, right across the board. As the current director of the CIA, William Burns, noted in a leaked cable, the entire political class of Russia was viscerally hostile to the idea of Ukraine entering NATO. George Kennan, one of the leading luminaries in U.S. foreign policy, warned about this in the 1990s. This was no flower. This was no person who was sympathetic to, a project of multilateralism. He was a U.S. neocon and imperialist through and through, but he understood the limits of U.S. power and said, if we expand NATO eastward, it will end in disaster. The entire U.S. political elite knew, as did the European political elite. Angela Merkel herself, when she was the most powerful leader in Europe as Chancellor of Germany, was unabashed in telling the American government, the Bush administration, that she was not at all comfortable with the idea of putting Ukraine into NATO because it could lead to a very bad place. So Angela Merkel knew it too. The entire European political elite knew that Ukraine's membership in NATO would provoke a strong military response from Russia, very likely an invasion of Ukraine, and they did it anyways. They insisted on Ukraine entering NATO anyways, even though there was absolutely no goddamn compelling reason, not even one that was semi-persuasive, why we should expand NATO to include Ukraine. In fact, the whole reason for NATO existing disappeared at the fall of the Soviet Union. And there was a rich historical record that when the Soviet Union fell, Western leaders from Europe and from the United States repeatedly assured the leaders of the Soviet Union at the time of the reunification of Germany that NATO would not expand eastward. They could have stopped the reunification of Germany. Despite its weakness, the Soviet military had the ability to impede the reunification of Germany. But they peacefully let it happen, despite the horrors, the monstrous horrors that were visited upon the Soviet Union by the Germans and their other European allies, including the Italians and the Romanians. They, despite all of that, were persuaded, the Soviet leadership, to allow the reunification of this state, which had caused monstrous suffering to the Soviet peoples, far worse than the suffering that the United States endured. And despite all of this, despite the fact that the Soviets allowed the reunification to happen peacefully when they could have impeded it, and they were allowing the reunification of a state that had inflicted such pain and suffering upon them, despite the fact they'd been given assurances by the American government, successive Americans, leaders, and by leaders of Europe that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward, despite the multiple attempts of Putin to try to work out some kind of a peaceful resolution to the civil war in the Donbass, which had been provoked by a U.S. orchestrated coup in Kiev. Yes, it was a coup. George Friedman, who at the time when he made the comment was the director of Stratfor, a national security consulting firm that is closely tied to the US government, said shortly after the coup in 2014 in Ukraine that removed violently from power an elected Ukrainian president who was simply trying to remain on good terms with everybody, including Russia. He said that it was the most obvious coup in history. That's what he called it. So by the time you get to January 2024, or 22, I should say, and you see how the American government has reacted and what it knows about the Russian attitude towards NATO expansion into Ukraine, the only rational conclusion you can come to is that they wanted this invasion to happen. They wanted the invasion to happen. They wanted it to happen because they thought it would provide the perfect pretext for them to wreck Russia's economy. The 2014 sanctions they had imposed had not caused enough damage to Russia to destabilize it politically and cause the removal from power of Vladimir Putin, which was their ultimate objective. And why? Not because they care about his human rights record, but because Vladimir Putin doesn't believe that Russia should be a vassal of the West. They don't give a damn about Vladimir Putin's human rights record. They don't care what he does in parts of the world where they have no interests. They don't give a damn about any of that. They don't care about democracy or free speech in Russia. They couldn't care less about those things. All they cared about was that Vladimir Putin believed that Russia should be treated as a great power. So for this, he had to go, and they need to orchestrate a reason to destroy Russia's economy. And so they provoked an invasion of Ukraine. That's exactly what they did. And if you don't see it, you're still drinking and are drunk on the NATO Kool-Aid. It's obvious. It's obvious. So I laid this out in an op-ed in February 2022, while acknowledging that as a technical matter, the invasion probably did violate the UN Charter. Now, from the moment that I made that argument and began also arguing as the battlefield developed, and those of us who were paying attention could see that Ukraine was in serious trouble from the very beginning, and looking at the numbers, the difference in population, the sizes of the economy, the energy resources, the strategic resolve of Russia to protect itself from what it regarded as an existential threat, it seemed increasingly obvious to me and others back in 2022 that Ukraine was going to lose this war. It was going to end up destroyed. So I wrote about all of that. And how did people on the so-called left, who claim to be anti-imperialist and be skeptics about the US government and to understand the reality of foreign policies, how did many of them react? Well, some of them, I must say, agreed with me without hesitation. They'd come to those conclusions on their own. They didn't need my help. But there was a sizable portion of the so-called progressive community which came down on me in a ton of bricks for saying the goddamn truth. That was the truth. I couldn't believe the level of abuse I was taking, including from people who claimed at some time to have been my supporters. It was mind-blowing. I thought the worst I had ever seen was the way people in the Zionist community came after me because I called for Israel to be held accountable, supported the BDS movement, accused Israeli leaders of being war criminals, accused Israel of running an apartheid regime. So I thought that was the worst I was going to ever see. But man, Ukraine took it to a whole new level of viciousness and absurdity. Absolute damn absurdity. And now what has happened? The architect of this disaster, who, yes, almost certainly did order an attack on the Nord Stream pipeline, causing the single biggest release of methane in recorded history, causing effectively the quite possibly irreparable damage to the German economy and other European economies by cutting off access to Russian gas, which was relatively inexpensive and affordable and reliable, and now increasing dramatically Europe's reliance upon LNG providers from the United States at higher environmental and financial cost to Europeans. What? How could people not see what was happening here? How could people not see that Ukraine, and to a lesser degree, all of Europe, was being exploited and weakened in order to increase the United States government's control over Europe and potentially the world? That's exactly what was happening. And all of those clowns in Canada and the United States, those depraved buffoons, they followed Genocide Joe all the damn way. And then came the genocide in Gaza. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine something worse than supporting, funding, fueling, arming a genocidal regime. That is the lowest of the low. That is the worst conceivable crime, both moral and legal, that a human being can commit. And that is what this damn President Joe Biden has been doing for 9 months with the middle finger, his aging, crooked middle finger, pointed in the face of the world the entire time. He is a genocidal racist, a monster, and the man is unfit to be the manager of the local 7-Eleven, let alone to be the president of the United States. And shame on all of you people. Shame on all of you people who supported Joe Biden and who didn't see the truth. You're an embarrassment. But you know what? You can all rehabilitate your reputations by coming forward and publicly stating mea culpa. You were wrong to support the Ukraine war. You were wrong to believe that Joe Biden would be a better president than Donald Trump. You were wrong to believe the Democratic Party had the slightest interest in the well-being of the American people or in peace or in justice or in international law. You were horribly wrong. And the last thing I want to say about the Democratic Party is now is the time to put this party out of business. There is no entity on God's green earth that is more responsible for the fact that Donald Trump is likely to be the next president of the United States than the goddamn Democratic Party. They sabotaged Bernie Sanders in 2016. He would have been a much better candidate. To a majority of Americans, they would have seen him as being a much better candidate than the corrupt, neoliberal, megalomaniacal Hillary Clinton. But no, they sabotaged Bernie Sanders. The Democratic Party cheated Bernie Sanders out of the nomination. And then when Hillary lost to Trump, they concocted this preposterous theory that Russia stole the election from Hillary. And for 3 years, they peddled this nonsense. And the Mueller report revealed in inglorious color that it was all a pack of lies. It was a complete pack of lies done, amongst other things, to paper over the fact that the Democratic Party has sabotaged Bernie Sanders, who had a much better chance of beating Trump, because for all of his flaws, and he has flaws, Bernie Sanders is a far superior candidate to Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. And I think most American people would have seen that, and that absolutely horrified the elite, that this slightly to the left of center Democratic Senator Bernie Sanders, who isn't really a socialist at the end of the day, and he's not really an anti-imperialist at the end of the day, he's just significantly more progressive and leftist and peace-oriented than the Democratic Party elite, and they couldn't even tolerate that. So we got stuck with Donald Trump. And then Bernie Sanders ran again in 2020. And what happened in 2020? Obama basically orchestrated Genocide Joe's emergence as the leading candidate by telling all the other candidates who were dividing that part of the vote up to get the hell out. And he left Elizabeth Warren in the race, who was going to siphon off enough votes from Bernie Sanders to make a Biden victory inevitable. And what happens in the middle of the campaign? In the middle of the campaign, Hunter Biden's laptop surfaces. And the thing is just crammed full of ultra embarrassing and dirty and nasty videos and commentaries and emails. But the stuff that's most pertinent for purposes of the American people is there was significant evidence of Biden family corruption, potentially implicating the president himself. And what happened in the middle of the election when this laptop, this beehive of depravity surfaced and became known to the public? Dozens of senior intelligence officials came forward and claimed with a straight face that the laptop had all the hallmarks of a Russian disinformation campaign. And at the time that they made that statement, that preposterous claim, which the corporate media ran with to the fullest of their ability, the FBI knew that it in fact was Hunter Biden's laptop and had known this for months. The Democratic Party knew it. The leadership of the Democratic Party, and certainly Joe Biden, knew. And they all propagated this lie, which was only made possible by dozens of senior intelligence, so-called intelligence officials signing on to this letter. That wasn't a subversion of U.S. democracy? Didn't they deprive from people information that might, in an informed sort of way, in a rational sort of way, cause them not to vote for Joe Biden? Of course it did. This was material information. That's precisely why they withheld it through their lies from the public, and the U.S. intelligence community interfered openly in the 2020 election with the complete cooperation, complicity, and enthusiastic support of the Democratic Party elite. And these people tell us that they are the protectors and the guardians of democracy. So now, after all of that, it was revealed, of course, that it was actually Hunter Biden's laptop. It was revealed that Russiagate was a complete hoax, a paranoid delusion of the Democratic Party elite. It was revealed that they had cheated on Bernie Sanders in 2016. All of this stuff came to light. And in that environment, Joe Biden, this decrepit character who even back in 2020 and 2019 was showing distinct signs of cognitive decline, becomes the President of the United States and proceeds to screw everything up and set the world on fire. And that is why we are now confronting an overwhelming likelihood of a second Donald Trump presidency. The Democratic Party is responsible for this travesty, and the Democratic Party should be abandoned by every right-thinking progressive on God's green earth. Don't give them a cent of money. Don't give them your vote, no matter what bullshit they sell you about how they're a better alternative than the Republicans. As Joe Biden said back in 2020 to rich donors at the Ritz-Carlton, nothing would fundamentally change under a Democratic president. And that's my rant of the week, following Joe Biden's announcement that he's getting mercifully out of the race.